The night he laughed was the night his command began to die, though at the time it felt like victory already belonged to him, settled and unquestionable, as solid as the sword at his hip and the rising sun stitched onto his cap. Colonel Masaru Takeda stood beneath the thick jungle canopy where moonlight barely reached the ground, listening as a junior officer finished translating the interceptive American radio chatter. The words themselves were mundane, talk of digging positions, rotating sentries, ammunition counts, yet Takeda's lips curved with amusement. He waved the officer away and turned to the men gathered around him, his voice calm, edged with disdain. The American Marines, he said, were loud and boastful but weak at heart. They hid behind machines, behind steel and noise, because they lacked the spirit to meet a blade in the dark. Effeminate, he called them, and cowardly, men softened by comfort and arrogance. Some of his officers nodded at once, eager to reflect their commander's certainty, while others glanced at the forest floor, their silence swallowed by insects and distant surf. Takeda had earned his confidence across years of war. He had marched through Chinese cities choked with smoke, crushed resistance with ruthless efficiency, and learned to believe that fear was the sharpest weapon of all. The enemy broke when pressed hard enough, when shown that mercy would never come. On this island, far from home, he saw no reason that truth would change. The Marines across the ridge were new to jungle fighting, he insisted, boys pretending to be warriors. His battalion, hardened by campaigns and indoctrinated in sacrifice, would shatter them in a single decisive blow. Night was his ally. Darkness belonged to those with courage, and he believed his men had courage in abundance. As the sun sank fully behind the trees, Takeda gathered his company commanders around a rough map scratched into the dirt. He outlined his plan with measured precision, tapping the ridge line where the Marines were said to be entrenched. A coordinated night assault, silent until the last moment, bayonets fixed, grenades ready. The first wave would rush the wire, overwhelm the sentries, and open gaps for the rest to pour through. Once inside the American lines, chaos would do the rest. He spoke of honor, of striking fear into the enemy's heart, of proving the superiority of Japanese arms and spirit. When he finished, several officers bowed deeply, eyes shining with fervor. Others masked their doubts behind rigid discipline. Preparations began at once. Rifles were checked, bayonets tightened, canteens secured. Men whispered final thoughts to one another, jokes forced and brittle, prayers murmured under breath. Takeda moved among them, offering brief words of approval, his presence steadying. He saw no reason to linger on fear. Fear was for the enemy. His soldiers straightened as he passed, drawing strength from his certainty. To them, he was the embodiment of experience, a man who had survived where others had fallen. If he believed the Marines would break, then surely they would. The jungle grew thicker as the battalion formed into assault columns and began to move. Leaves brushed against helmets. Branches snapped softly under boots. The humid air clung to skin, carrying the smell of earth and decay. Somewhere ahead lay the American positions, invisible in the dark, yet Takeda imagined them clearly. Shallow foxholes, nervous sentries gripping rifles with trembling hands, waiting for an attack they would not withstand. He pictured panic spreading at the first shout, men firing wildly, officers losing control. The image pleased him. He adjusted his sword belt and pressed forward, confident that by dawn the ridge would be theirs. Time stretched oddly in the jungle night. Minutes felt like hours, steps like miles. The only sounds were breathing, the distant cry of birds, the constant hum of insects. Takeda raised a fist, halting the column. Scouts crept ahead to confirm the approach. He crouched low, eyes scanning the darkness, senses sharpened. Somewhere, a faint metallic glint suggested wire. Beyond it, shadowed shapes hinted at fortification. Still no movement, no sound of alarm. He felt vindicated. The Marines were careless, unprepared, just as he had said. The signal came, a barely audible hiss, and Takeda gave the order to advance. The first wave surged forward, bodies low, rifles held tight. For a heartbeat, the night remained silent. Then everything changed. A sudden white flare burst overhead, bathing the clearing in harsh, unforgiving light. Takeda's breath caught as the illusion shattered. The Marines were not asleep. They were waiting. Machine guns roared to life, tearing through the darkness with brutal clarity. Men fell instantly, their charges cut short in sprays of dirt and blood. Mortars thumped, and moments later explosions ripped into the advance ranks, sending bodies spinning, screams tearing free at last. Takeda shouted orders, his voice hoarse, trying to push the attack forward, but the noise swallowed him. The carefully planned assault dissolved into fragments of chaos. Units lost cohesion, officers disappeared in flashes of light and smoke, and fear spread faster than any command. The Marines fired with relentless discipline, adjusting their aim, calling out targets, reloading with practiced ease. They did not run. They did not hesitate. They fought like men who had already accepted the night and mastered it. At last, near midnight, reality forced its way through his resolve. Continuing the assault meant annihilation. With a bitterness that tasted like ash, he ordered a withdrawal. Few heard him at first. Runners were sent, some never returned. Those who could still move began to pull back, dragging wounded comrades, abandoning the dead. The jungle that had sheltered their advance now closed around their retreat, indifferent to honor or disgrace. Takeda followed, his body heavy, his thoughts louder than the gunfire fading behind him. The words he had spoken earlier echoed cruelly in his mind. Effeminate, cowardly. Each syllable mocked him now. The Marines had shown neither softness nor fear. They had stood firm and lethal, their discipline unbroken under pressure. His certainty, so carefully built over years, had collapsed in a single night. By the time the firing finally died down, the battalion was shattered. Survivors gathered in small, stunned clusters, faces gray, eyes unfocused. Officers counted heads and stopped, unable to reconcile numbers with reality. Takeda stood apart, staring into the darkness where the ridge still loomed unconquered. The night air felt colder now, heavier. He understood with a clarity he had never allowed himself before that contempt had blinded him, and that the enemy he had dismissed had already won something far greater than ground. The retreat did not feel like survival to Colonel Takeda, only postponement. The jungle that swallowed the remnants of his battalion seemed to close in with judgment rather than shelter. Every rustle sounding like accusation, every shadow like another failure stepping into view. Men stumbled through tangled roots and fallen branches, some bleeding, some stunned silent, others whispering prayers they had not spoken in years. Takeda moved among them without speaking, his boots heavy with mud, his sword knocking softly against his leg, the sound marking his passage like a slow, shameful drum. He had ordered the withdrawal, yet the word echoed inside him as defeat. The weight of it bent his spine more than the hours of marching ever could. They halted just before dawn in a shallow depression where the trees thinned enough to let gray light seep through. Officers gathered, faces pale, uniforms torn, expressions stripped of certainty. Numbers were called out, names checked, voices breaking as the reality formed. Entire platoons were gone, companies reduced to handfuls of men. Medics worked without pause, hands slick, bandages scarce, choosing who might live through the day and who would not. Takeda listened, jaw clenched, as reports piled upon one another, each one a quiet hammer striking the same cracked place in his pride. He forced himself to walk the perimeter, to look at the survivors, to see what his decisions had cost. A young private stared at nothing, lips trembling, rifle clutched, as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. An older sergeant sat with his back against a tree, eyes closed, breathing, shallow shrapnel wounds seeping through hastily tied cloth. These were men who had trusted him, men who had marched into the night, believing his words. Takeda felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Not fear, but the sharp ache of responsibility finally felt rather than proclaimed. As the sun rose higher, distant artillery rumbled from the Marine positions, a reminder that the enemy remained alert and unbroken. Takeda imagined them now in daylight, moving confidently among their defenses, repairing wire, sharing cigarettes, speaking casually of the night's work. The image burned. He had expected panic, collapse, retreat. Instead, they had held firm, killing with method and patience. He wondered how many Marines had fallen and knew instinctively that the number would be nothing compared to his own losses. Orders arrived from higher command by runner, brief and merciless. Hold position, regroup, prepare for renewed resistance. There was no comfort, no inquiry into what had gone wrong, only the assumption that losses were the natural currency of war. Takeda read the message twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his tunic. The army did not care about his arrogance or his misjudgment, only results. Yet he cared now, perhaps too late. He gathered his remaining officers and spoke with a restraint they had not heard before. There was no talk of effeminate enemies, no grand declarations of inevitable victory. He acknowledged the failure of the assault, praised the courage of those who had advanced despite the fire, and ordered defensive preparation. Trenches were dug, fields of fire cleared, positions improved with a quiet urgency born of hard lesson. The men worked without complaint, their movements mechanical. The bravado of the previous night burned away. Throughout the day, Takeda's thoughts returned again and again to the moment. The flares had ignited the sky. He replayed it endlessly, searching for a different decision, a pause, a reconnaissance missed, a warning ignored. Each replay ended the same way, with the understanding that contempt had replaced caution, that he had wanted the enemy to be weak, because it made victory easier to imagine. The realization hollowed him out. That night, Marine patrols probed their lines, small, sharp encounters that kept everyone awake. Gunfire crackled briefly, then faded, leaving nerves raw. Takeda sat in his command position, map spread before him, unable to sleep. He listened to the jungle and felt no ownership of it now. Darkness no longer felt like an ally, only an equal threat to all who moved within it. He wondered how many of his men lay unburied on the ridge and whether the Marines would treat their dead with respect. The thought surprised him, and he did not know what it said about him that he cared. By morning, the final casualty reports were complete. Nearly 87% of his battalion was gone. The number stared back at him, stark and undeniable. It was not merely a tactical loss, it was annihilation. Takeda closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, forcing himself to accept the truth without flinching. History would record the night as a failure, perhaps as incompetence. His name would be attached to it whether he wished it or not. When orders came to withdraw further and reorganize under another command, Takeda complied without protest. He gathered his belongings, what little remained intact, and prepared to move. As they marched away from the ridge, he allowed himself one final look back. The jungle hid the Marine positions again, inscrutable and silent, but he knew what lay there now. Not cowards, not softness, only soldiers who had stood their ground and paid the price of doing so. The march was quiet, No songs, no speeches, just the sound of boots, the weight of memory. Takeda felt older with every step, as if the night had carved years into his bones. He did not know what awaited him next, whether redemption, further failure, or death. He only knew that the illusion he had carried into the darkness was gone forever, burned away by flares and gunfire, leaving behind a harder, linear understanding of war and of himself. Dawn came without ceremony, as if the world itself refused to acknowledge what had been lost during the night. Colonel Masaru Takeda stood at the edge of the temporary encampment, while thin sunlight filtered through torn leaves and drifting smoke. The air smelled of damp earth, cordite, and blood that had soaked too deeply into the ground to be washed away. Around him, the remnants of his battalion moved slowly, shadows of the force that had marched forward with confidence only hours earlier. Their silence was heavier than any accusation, and Takeda felt it press against him with every breath he took. He ordered the dead gathered where possible, though many would never be found. Jungle and fire had claimed them together. For those recovered, shallow graves were dug, marked with rough wooden stakes bearing hastily written names. Takeda watched each burial, standing rigid, offering the prescribed words, his voice steady, even as something inside him fractured further. These men had trusted him not only with their lives, but with the meaning of their deaths. Now he wondered what meaning could possibly be enough. As the last grave was covered, Marine artillery sounded again in the distance, not directed at them now, but persistent, like a reminder that the enemy still controlled the rhythm of the battlefield. Takeda felt no anger toward the Marines anymore, only a cold respect sharpened by regret. They had fought as professionals, not as the caricatures he had created to make his own certainty easier. In defeating his men, they had also defeated his illusions. Higher command summoned him before noon. The meeting was brief and unforgiving. Maps were spread, fingers traced movements, questions asked without sympathy. Why had he ordered a frontal night assault against a prepared position? Why had reconnaissance been insufficient? Why had losses been so catastrophic? Takeda answered honestly, stripping his explanations of pride. He spoke of underestimation, of assumption, of failure. The generals listened, faces unreadable, then dismissed him with curt nods. His reassignment was immediate. Another officer would take what remained of the unit. Takeda was to report elsewhere, his future uncertain. Walking away from the command tent, Takeda felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because the burden of authority had been lifted, heavier because the weight of responsibility did not leave with it. Rank could be removed, memory could not. He wondered how many of the Marines on the ridge would remember the night as clearly as he would. Perhaps to them it was just another battle survived, another line in a long war. To him it would define everything that came after. That evening, as preparations for movement continued, Takeda found himself alone near the edge of the camp. The jungle was quieter now, as if exhausted by violence. He removed his cap and wiped his brow, staring at his reflection in the dull metal of his canteen. He looked older, thinner, his eyes less certain. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to question not tactics but belief. He had been taught that contempt for the enemy was strength, that seeing them as lesser made killing easier and victory inevitable. Yet that belief had led him directly into ruin. When the column finally moved out, Takeda walked at the rear, no longer at the center of attention. Men passed him without saluting, unsure of his status, unsure of what to feel. He did not correct them. Titles seemed meaningless now. What mattered was the truth he carried forward, whether he liked it or not. Days later, rumors reached them. The Marines still held the ridge. Their casualties had been light. Reinforcements had arrived. The front line stabilized, then shifted elsewhere, the war grinding onward with indifference. Takeda listened to the whispers without comment. Each confirmation tightened the lesson carved into him that night. Victory did not belong to those who mocked. It belonged to those who prepared, endured, and refused to break. Weeks passed. Takeda was assigned to a staff role far from the front, a quiet exile disguised as necessity. Maps replaced jungles, reports replaced gunfire. Yet sleep did not come easily. Night after night flares bloomed behind his closed eyes, turning darkness into judgment. He heard the machine guns again, felt the helpless momentum of men running into fire because he had told them the enemy was weak. He woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the taste of ash still in his mouth. One evening he received a letter from home. It spoke of ordinary things, of weather and family, of pride in his service. He folded it carefully and placed it beside the earlier orders he had carried from the battlefield. 2 pieces of paper, both heavy in different ways. He wondered what he would say if he ever returned, how he would explain the gap between the man he had been and the one he was becoming. The war would not end soon. More nights, more battles, more losses would come, led by men who believed as he once had, or perhaps by men who had already learned what he learned too late. Takeda understood now that courage was not loud declarations or contemptuous laughter. It was the discipline to respect an enemy, the humility to plan carefully, the strength to accept reality even when it contradicted belief. Somewhere across the ocean, Marines trained and fought and buried their own dead, never knowing the private reckoning of the man who had dismissed them. They would never hear his apology, never know that his laughter had died in the same night as most of his command. War did not allow such exchanges, it only recorded outcomes. Years later, when the conflict ended and survivors returned home, Takeda would still remember the ridge, the flares, the sudden revelation that arrogance could be deadlier than any weapon. He would remember the 87% who never walked out of the jungle, and the enemy who taught him the cost of contempt. And in the quiet moments that followed the end of fighting, when uniforms were folded away and medals lost their shine, that memory would remain, sharp and instructive, a final verdict delivered not by a court or a superior, but by the unforgiving truth of one night when mockery met reality, and reality did not blink.